Well, ready?
Yes.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Brookings Institutions. Welcome to those of you who are joining us here physically, and also welcome to everybody who's watching online. And thank you very much for being part of this conversation today. I am absolutely delighted to be the moderator of this, to be the person talking to Stephanie Williams. She has written what I think is essential reading for anyone that wants to understand post-Qaddafi Libya, for anyone who has an interest in conflict mediation today, the tools needed for creative conflict mediation and prevention today. And Stephanie is someone who, I mean, you are uniquely qualified for having written this book, for writing such a book, because she has had 4 different positions focused on Libya for 2 different institutions. For the State Department, she was the head of the North Africa desk in the Bureau of Near East Affairs, focused on Libya. And she also was U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, one of the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in post-Qaddafi Libya. So she had that U.S. perspective and focus on Libya. And then she went to the United Nations, and she was the Deputy Special Representative at the UN mission in Libya, the UN support mission in Libya, UNSMIL. You'll hear us say UNSMIL, I think, quite a bit today. And then later she was sort of reincarnated and became the top person for the UN in Libya. So she has seen Libyan issues from both a national level from the State Department as well as an international public servant. She's also lived in the Gulf and has deep knowledge about the Arab states that were so involved in the post-Qaddafi Libya. Now, I first met you and your husband Tom when we were together in Tunisia in the late 1980s, but we really didn't work together until later, when I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs at the State Department, and Stephanie was the head of the North Africa desk. But our close cooperation, and where my admiration for you, Stephanie, really amplified, was when you were Chargé d'Affaires in Manama, Bahrain. Stephanie was Chargé d'Affaires in Bahrain during the Arab Spring, and you may remember that Bahrain was one of the countries where there were protests, and Manama, the capital, was sort of engulfed in protests, and then there was a Saudi, UAE, Bahraini military crackdown against the protests. I was traveling back and forth to Bahrain quite frequently, and I saw firsthand, I witnessed the creativity that Stephanie brought to her diplomacy, the skills that she had, the empathy she had for the people she was dealing with. And what really wowed me were the language skills that Stephanie, I mean, I say I speak Arabic, but I would never do what Stephanie did, which was to go on Arab cable TV to debate officials who were furious about US policy at that time. Now, I didn't work with Stephanie at the UN. I had unfortunately stepped down from my UN job, not knowing that just a couple months later, one of my favorite colleagues was going to be recruited by the UN to be the Deputy Special Representative. So, but I assure you, I did follow her career in Libya, even though I was already at that point at Brookings. And this book is her story. It is the UN story, but it's mostly Libya's story. And I think that this book is going to endure as the reference book for that period in Libya's history that she covers. And so, Stephanie, you're welcome to be here. Stephanie is a non-resident fellow at Brookings, and it's delightful to have this non-resident fellow here today, physically.
Thank you.
I also want to recognize that she's joined by her son Alec, who's also here today. So welcome to Alec as well as to all of you. And for all of you, this book is available in the lobby. And I think that probably you can get an author's signature. I just got an author's signature on my own copy. And it's an exclusive because it's not available until July 2nd in the United States more generally. So get it today. And let me note as well that Stephanie's donating all the proceeds to charity. So Stephanie, let's get started on our conversation.
Thank you, Jeff.
You know, in your book, you wrote fairly early on, and in fact, it was the theme of the book, that the UN mediation was never about 2 guys, one from the East, one from the West, and bringing them into a room. Mm-hmm. And you basically argue that the perception that most of us have about Libya just being divided between East and West, parallel institutions, parallel governments, is not, in fact, the Libyan reality. And that you had to deal with a lot more complex situation than just East versus West. So to start off, could you describe to us how you think we should be thinking about Libya? How do you paint Libya in a way that will get us beyond that binary East-West image that I think probably most of, at least I have?
So thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here in person at Brookings. Thank you all for coming. It's so hot outside, but I appreciate your attendance, and thank you for the very kind introduction, Jeff. I should say that Jeff was one of my mentors in the Foreign Service. And
easy to mentor an expert.
No, I learned a lot from you, and I continue to learn a lot from you. But on Libya, so yes, we did try to go beyond the stale formula of mediation of getting 2 or 4 guys into a room somewhere to strike a deal. What our reading, and I should say when I say our, it's when I joined the United Nations mission in Libya, the special representative was Dr. Hassan Salama, who is a Lebanese diplomat and academic, and he made it our mission to really do a thorough analysis before we started any mediation, to do a thorough analysis of the scene in Libya. And that required us, in conjunction with an NGO called the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, to reach out to literally thousands of Libyans through in-person meetings to understand the scene. And our analysis showed that rather than this division, you always hear Libya is a divided country, there's the West and the East, that what happened after Mr. Qaddafi's overthrow was an implosion that led to a deep societal fragmentation. And that you could attribute it to the 42 years of his rule, his upendings of the bureaucracy, the brutality of his regime, the use of the mukhabarat, the isolation that Libyans lived in for so many years before the events of 2011. And so it was our goal to sort of pick up the pieces of that societal implosion and to gather the Libyans together and to, importantly, conduct an inclusive mediation, which meant opening the door to the adherents of Mr. Qaddafi, who had been in large part excluded. They had either excluded themselves or had been excluded from previous UN mediation exercises. So we did a lot of outreach. And therefore, we built this entire event, which came to be known as the National Conference, that was aborted by the attack on Tripoli, the attack on Tripoli by General Haftar in April 2019, while the Secretary General, our boss, was on the ground in Tripoli. And then we take the story from there. But yes, I think it is easy to say, okay, it's divided because you have 2 governments and there's a certain division of institutions, but it is, I think, far more complex than that. And I'm pleased to see that the UN, in the current leadership of the mission, continues with an inclusive mediation approach.
Stephanie, you mentioned General Haftar, who's in the East. And your book is full of spoilers. Your book is full of predatory politicians, be they Libyan or be they non-Libyan. But General Haftar kind of stands out in a class of his own. And I remember that and you mentioned the 2019 National Conference, that was being planned for the oasis town in eastern Libya, Ghadames. You yourself personally, as well as the mission as a whole, had put a lot of work into that conference. The Secretary General's trip to Libya was in part to build momentum for that conference, of bringing all those different groups that you had been reaching out to together. Your boss, Ghassan Salami, who you mentioned, the then special representative, had brought the prime minister of the recognized government in Tripoli, Siraj, and Haftar together in Abu Dhabi in early 2019. Mm-hmm. And yet, Haftar overthrew this whole thing. Mm-hmm. Even though this was not a surprise, it was going to be a national conference, he attacked Tripoli, basically to disrupt the conference, among other things. Mm-hmm. And it's not the only time that Haftar, the General Haftar, or Field Marshal Haftar, I should say, played a spoiler role. Mm-hmm. But yet, there were a lot of countries that were sort of flirting with him. And so I'm wondering if you could explain what it is that he was doing that these countries supported, and who in Libya truly supports him.
Great question. So I would say we can look at General Haftar through the Rorschach test. So and this mostly would apply to the external actors. So the Rorschach tests for, let's say, the United States and France would be that they saw him through the lens of counterterrorism, that he would be a strong partner, that he had tackled some extremist groups in eastern Libya and calmed the situation there, and therefore that he could somehow become a reliable CT partner for these countries. This despite, I think, the fact that the major counterterrorism effort in Libya in the last 14 years was the battle against Daesh, against ISIS in Sirte, where he opted out. He decided not to participate in that effort, and instead forces from the western city of Misrata joined in a coalition with the United States and the United Kingdom, and quite a number of young men from the city of Misrata lost their lives or were horribly mutilated in these battles against Daesh, who was eventually ousted from Sirte. So you have the counterterrorism lens. More immediately in the neighborhood, you could say in the region, they look at Mr. Haftar through an ideological lens. So it's the Manichaean view of the Islamists versus the so-called secular forces. This despite the fact that he has a number of Salafi forces in his larger coalition, hardline Salafi Islamist forces. So that's another lens. It's part of this wider regional struggle. In terms of sub-Saharan Africa, they looked at him more through the lens of somebody who could replace what Qaddafi had meant for them. In fact, I recall a conversation that we had in the fall of 2018. We met with a leader from sub-Saharan Africa who has since been overthrown in the coup belt, as we call it, just south of Libya, who said, well, what Libya needs is a petit Napoleon. And we think that he is in Rajma, which is the stronghold of Mr. Haftar. So it really depended on the perspective of the external actor and how they viewed Mr. Haftar. Now, internally in Libya, of course, he was a well-known figure. He had been in the coterie of Mr. Qaddafi in 1969, in the bloodless coup that overthrew the Senussi monarchy. He was a second-tier figure, but he came a cropper with Qaddafi in the mid-1980s in the Chad campaign, and then he was scooped up by the CIA and lived not far from here in McLean for a number of years before returning to Libya during the uprising in 2011. So what he was able to do, very briefly, particularly in the years following the revolution, and when he was sort of not able to secure the positions that he wanted in Tripoli, and when he moved east, he gathered up some of the remnants of Mr. Qaddafi's forces, and for the people of the east, he became more of a stabilizing figure because, of course, starting in 2012, the east fell into this maelstrom of terrible violence that took many lives, including the lives of the life of our former colleague Chris Stevens and other colleagues in the State Department in 2012. And so he became, he was able to quell a lot of the unrest in eastern Libya. And so for that population, even though he did it in a way that was quite brutal, and he still rules with an iron fist. In comparison, perhaps, to what they were experiencing before, there was some degree of appreciation.
Well, you and Ghassan, of course, you later as the top UN official, of course, were operating under a mandate from the Security Council. That Security Council mandate includes recognition of the government in Tripoli as the legitimate government of Libya. That government does not have physical control over all of Libya's sovereign territory for the reasons we've been discussing. So when you would go see General Haftar, who did not recognize the government in Libya that you recognized as part of the Security Council mandate, how did you deal with this contradiction that you needed him or the people around him to work with you on initiatives, but yet you were representing a mandate that said you're not the one in charge, that he's not the one in charge?
Right. Well, this was something that and I talk about this in the book, is sort of the role of the United Nations in Libya and the fact that we were dual-hatted, that not only were you were the mediator, and post-2014, this became a critical role for the UN in Libya as either local conflicts, or national wars broke out, that you were more forced into the mediation role, just, to stop the violence and to get Libyans back to the negotiating table. But at the same time, you were the head of the support mission, which meant that you dealt with the UN and you supported the UN recognized government, who was not recognized by other populations in Libya, be it, Mr. Haftar's forces. And that was, at times, we spent a significant portion of our time explaining our role. Yes, I would say that of course, we pushed quite early on to reopen our office in Benghazi, which had been closed in 2012, or in that period shortly after the violence erupted in eastern Libya. We'd had to, and in fact, in 2014, most of the international community withdrew from Libya, the United States and many other embassies, and the international staff of the UN. We only went back in 2017 and then permanently in early 2019. And so we were in Tripoli, but we pushed to reopen our office in Benghazi so that we could have more contact with the population in the East. And this is because of this history also of marginalized feelings of marginalization in Libya. It's, you're talking about a country that's 3 times the size of France. So Benghazi is
with only what, 6 million people?
7 million people. 7 million people, and this is historical resentment of over-centralization of decision-making in Tripoli, which is quite far away. So therefore, opening that office in Benghazi, showing that the UN was there to meet with and support all Libyans, not just those sitting in Tripoli, not just those officially recognized by the United Nations. And that was, a conversation. It got a lot more difficult after April 2019, when polarization occurred, which was driven a lot by social media and electronic armies and the use of hate speech. And so therefore, again, reaching out to people in eastern Libya who had dehumanized their compatriots in western Libya where the attack was occurring, and having that conversation, whether it was with Mr. Haftar, whether it was with his supporters or simply ordinary Libyans.
I mean, I just noticed, it's not a unique issue that the UN political leaders in Libya had to deal with this contradiction between being a impartial mediator and supporting a recognized government. We see it in Yemen. Mm-hmm. We see it in other places as well, of the UN having to try to somehow reconcile these two mandates that are kind of in conflict. Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011. What you call the second, and then in 2014, of course, Libya, the institutions have sort of collapsed. You started to have the divisions. You talk about 2019 as being a second Libyan civil war. So it's been a while. Yeah. Are there any institutions in Libya that still retain sort of popular legitimacy to build around? In your book, I mean, I think most of us who look at things like this say, oh, elections. Elections give legitimacy to leaders. Elections give legitimacy to institutions. The Libyans seem to want to have elections, want to be able to exercise their right at the ballot box. But your book is cautious on that. Your book sort of suggests that if we aren't careful, elections could make things worse, if I'm reading it correctly. So how do you see rebuilding legitimization of the institutions? What's your sequencing?
Well, so I do talk about this in the book, and I draw on the lessons that we learned in 2021. Because, of course, national elections had been decided upon by the political forum that I mediated, which set a date for elections of December 21st, 2021. But, of course, the roadmap that was agreed by that political forum was very carefully constructed to avoid the pitfalls that had befallen previous mediation efforts, where the Libyan ruling class had essentially sabotaged the way forward. So we had put in deadlines for things like agreeing a constitutional framework. Now, I think most people would be surprised to learn that Libya, 14 years after Mr. Qaddafi's downfall, still does not have a constitution. So this is kind of one fundamental mediation that remains in a state of suspense. And this means that Libyans, and it's not because I'm a missionary for constitutions, and certainly there are many constitutions that are violated. What seemed to me, and more importantly, to the members of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, was that Libyans needed to have an understanding and a consensus around what kind of state do they want. Simply a presidential system, a prime ministerial system, centralized, decentralized, all of these, I think, very basic questions had not been answered. That needed to be agreed. And then you move on to elections legislation. Well, unfortunately, in 2021, they sort of jumped all over that. They just, okay, well, that was too hard, so let's go directly to elections legislation, which was not agreed consensually, and then which opened the door to 99 presidential candidates, including the son of Mr. Qaddafi, Mr. Haftar, and the prime minister of the UN-recognized government, who had pledged not to run. So these were all spoiling activities. This was to ensure that there was a consensus amongst this class. And I always say Libyans may shoot at each other by day, but they collude at night to prevent change. And it was a classic example. So they really needed to, I said they needed to eat their vegetables on finishing the fundamentals of the constitutional process before going to what they all love, which is another executive arrangement, which means it's a power sharing, we call it Muhassasa arrangement, where this redistributive kleptocracy just shuffles the seats amongst themselves. So you needed to break that cycle. That didn't happen in 2021. It's what has, I think, led to this precarious state that we have now, where there's violence. So the ceasefire has held, the nationwide ceasefire has held.
But you brokered in October 2020.
Right, exactly, with a great UN team, and that is held, but it's very fragile. And until these fundamental political questions are tackled, you're always going to have this threat of violence looming over the horizon.
What about what I could call the insider-outsider question? Certainly, the outsiders have been involved on both sides of this. I'm reverting back to the two sides of Libya. Sorry about that, but on all sides, I should say that the outsiders have been involved, and you and Ghassan Salami. And then you, after you were the top official and Ghassan had left, focused on both, the inside and the outside. There was the Berlin conference of January 2020 that was the outsiders. And then that was followed, of course, by the ceasefire in October, insiders with outsider support. And then you had the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum that was later that same year, that was the insiders. Can you talk about how did you work with the insiders, outsiders? And if I may ask, were there any of them on the inside or outside that were actually working with you in good faith?
Yes, there were. Perhaps not enough. But yeah, so we had, prior to April of 2019, we did what was essentially an inside-outside mediation. So we were determined to gather the Libyans and then take that product to the international community. But that, was aborted and sabotaged. What we encountered on April 5th, let's say 2019, was an entirely dysfunctional Security Council where they couldn't even agree. They couldn't even issue a statement to ask the Libyans to stop fighting. It took the Security Council over 3 months to really say anything about Libya. Forget a resolution, just a statement.
Well, and it's worth noting that you had members of the Security Council, including P5 members, the 5 permanent with the veto powers, who year after year recognized the government in Tripoli as being the legitimate government, while we're actually working more closely with Haftar.
Yep. Yes. So we, recognizing the sterility of the Security Council, we said, okay, we now need to shift our efforts to an outside-in approach, which is where the idea of Berlin took form. And Ghassan went to see then Chancellor Merkel, and the Germans agreed to partner with the United Nations. And we started a process of 7 Sherpa meetings over the course of the fall of 2019, while the conflict was hot, culminating in this conference in Berlin, but also the creation of an entire international architecture under which that, by the way, Berlin included the countries that were directly interfering on the ground. The Egyptians, the Turks, by that time the Turks were in on the side of the UN recognized government, and the Emiratis. And of course you had the P5, you also had Italy at the table given their historical role in Libya. And then you had the regional organizations, African Union, European Union, League of Arab States, and the United Nations. So the whole approach was to bring these quarreling internationals together to get them to agree on fundamentals and to build this umbrella under which we nested all the intra-Libyan tracks, political, economic, and military, to protect the Libyan mediation and so that the Libyans could see that these internationals had reached some consensus. And under that, we were able, once we had a cessation of hostilities in June of 2020, we were able to proceed with the Libyans. And that's what led to the ceasefire agreement, the political agreement, and very importantly, and under-recognized, all the work that we did on the economic track, which we mainstreamed into our mediation, which had really was something new for a United Nations political mission. But we insisted on addressing these economic drivers of a conflict because, of the conflict, because Libya is a one-crop economy, and that this is not an ideological conflict. This is a conflict over control of resources.
Two questions. First, why Germany? And second, on the economic side, you talk in the book about Libya's oil wealth is both a blessing and a curse. How did in your economic work, how were you able to try to redirect that toward the blessing side and less toward the curse side?
Okay, on Germany, Germany was sort of a natural choice. So Germany was on the Security Council at the time. They were also chair of the Sanctions Committee. They had abstained on Resolution 1973 authorizing the NATO intervention. So they were viewed also more neutrally and as being more impartial by Libyans, and that was important. Of course, you had the personality of Chancellor Merkel, who already had established very good relations with some of the key players, be it President Erdogan, be it President Putin, President Sisi, all of these countries who at the actual conference sent their heads of state came. So, and she, I think, was quite determined to do something positive on Libya because of course, the issue of migration is politically sensitive and a hot potato in the European Union. So Germany fell into place. And then on the economic question, well, look, we did a couple of things. One is we conducted an audit of the Central Bank of Libya. Because the Central Bank of Libya was a disputed and continues, unfortunately, to be a disputed institution. Located in Tripoli, the subject of, the capital being the subject of attack. And there was a lot of controversy on how the oil revenues were being spent. So we, quite unusually, I'm not sure there's any other UN mission, political mission that's ever done this, we facilitated the conduct of a financial review / audit of the bank. And this was also at the request of the UN recognized Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Siraj, because we were coming off another one of the famous, blockades of Libya's oil terminals by various characters. In the earlier years, it was this guy, Ibrahim Jadran, and then later, during 2020, the 8-month-long oil blockade was Mr. Haftar under the rubric of the tribes have closed the oil terminals, but it was really Mr. Haftar. But we felt that it was important to do this audit / review, financial review of the bank that came up with recommendations for the unification of the bank. First and foremost, because it was one of the institutions that had splintered, but also on best practices moving forward. Unfortunately, the full report of the audit was never published. That was contrary to the direction of the UN team that led the process, meaning Ghassan and myself, later myself.
Was that the UN headquarters that blocked it?
No, it was more local. didn't block it, but they capitulated to, I would say they capitulated to the Libyan desire that this should be a sovereign product. And therefore only a summary of the audit was. I felt that it was a lost opportunity to demonstrate complete transparency. Because anytime a report becomes confidential, first of all, it's eventually leaked and then selectively used. So, which is exactly what happened with the audit. But it was an important exercise, and I see now that other Libyan institutions, including the Libyan Audit Bureau themselves, are asking to be audited by the UN now. So, it set an example which I think has continued.
Transparency. Could you talk a little bit about the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum? Because I don't think Libyan politicians quite knew what they were getting into in what you were setting up, because they have to, for the first time and maybe the last time so far, answer to Libyan public questions. So could you talk about how you did that? Because we often talk about how social media, Facebook, et cetera, can undermine mediation, can polarize people, can deepen divisions and make solutions harder, but you used it creatively.
Yeah, well, so the decision I took to really be fully transparent on the LPDF came after the holding of the first session in Tunis, where some events were broadcast live.
These were bringing together Libyan political leaders from different factions.
Right, and some were from existing institutions, and we selected 35 members of the forum out of 75. But what occurred was just a sea of disinformation and sabotage online. And Libya is a Facebook country. There are more Facebook accounts in Libya than there are Libyans. And they spend, that's great. Everyone's a keyboard warrior. And after 42 years of a very sterile information ecosystem, Libyans now have a freedom of expression. But with that came a lot of disinformation. Stanford University conducted a study in December of 2020, a month after the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, where they documented the efforts on the part of Mr. Prigozhin and his...
who makes a cameo appearance in this book.
Make a later appearance, but this is where I first encountered his work with the his IRA information research group out of Moscow. So they were working with various actors in the region to essentially spoil and to spread a lot of disinformation. So Facebook ended up taking down about 100 accounts. We had also had the situation where female members of the Political Dialogue Forum were directly threatened online, and so we were already working with Facebook. But to push back against a lot of this disinformation, I decided for the second physical meeting of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, where it was decided that a new executive would be selected, that we would broadcast most of the sessions live, including interviews with candidates. And yes, it came to be known as the National Barbecue. And initially, Libyans weren't tuning in, but when they started hearing about the questions that were being asked of those candidates for the positions of prime minister and president, they got very interested, because their politicians had never, been questioned in such a direct manner. So, and then we broadcast all of the voting process live as well.
And force the candidates to make certain commitments about abiding by
candidates, which they then, reneged on, unfortunately. And I think that was a big mistake, to allow them to walk back their promises.
The promises to the UN and to the Libyan people.
And to the Libyan, most importantly, to their compatriots, right.
I've got a couple more questions to ask you, Stephanie, and then just audience, and think of your questions. We'll open it up to the floor shortly, and we have questions online. The questions online have to deal with the prospects for democracy and stabilization in Libya. So think about that too in the context of the questions that we get. But I guess one of my questions is, if you were advising Hannah Teta is the current head of UNSMIL. She's the former Ghanaian foreign minister, and she has a lot of UN experience. She's been the UN Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. She was the UN representative to the African Union, which helps sort of heal that UN-AU fight, or tension over Libya, I should say. Mm-hmm. What would your advice be to Hannah?
Well,
and you know Hannah.
Yeah, we've met.
Okay,
yes, yeah. And I've met Stephanie Khoury, who's the deputy. So it's a terrific UN team on the ground. I think Libyans are quite fortunate to have this particular team. I'm really what I was really pleased to see is that they've had another meeting in Berlin of the Berlin international process, and so that re-engaging, and again, because you're seeing this now fragmentation on the international scene regarding Libya, pulling internationals together, and that more broadly they are maintaining a very inclusive mediation approach, reaching out, conducting polling, and just meeting with a lot of Libyans. So I think that the prospects are quite positive. I hope. Yeah.
What would you say, if it were welcome, what would you say to the U.S. administration about Libya?
Well, I've seen a lot of the reporting about some transactional arrangements, whether it be sending migrants from the U.S. to Libya. First of all, Libya is not a safe place for migrants. That was always our message to the European Union when we traveled to those capitals. That when boats were turned back in the Mediterranean, those people should never go back to Libya because of the conditions in the detention centers, which are just absolutely horrendous. So I certainly hope that if that was brewing in the administration, that that idea is abandoned. As well as there was a cockamamie story about Palestinians, being ethnically cleansed from Gaza and sent to Libya, which, first of all, the Libyan people would absolutely reject that. So if that was at all in the mix, it should, so a bad idea on multiple fronts. So,
what about a good idea? What would a good idea be?
What would a good idea be? I think that getting behind the UN mediation, I understand that this administration takes a dim view of the United Nations, but in my view, the United Nations remains the most prominent and plausible impartial mediator in Libya, and it would be smart of the administration to get behind the UN leadership on this one, and hold spoilers to account. This has always been the message. Libyans like to park their money overseas, mostly in Europe and the United States, and they like to visit their money. Sanctions actually work. And I know that's a very controversial subject, but I have seen it. I've seen the threat of sanctions lead to a change in behavior. And so look at the sanctions tool and consider using it, even if it's just a threat, because you can actually get Libyans to sort of move off their spoiling behavior.
Stephanie, you and I both served as U.S. Foreign Service officers in multiple countries overseas, and we both served as international public servants. We both went from our U.S. careers to our UN careers. I was at headquarters. You were at a field mission. The field missions are far more fun than headquarters, I assure you. But can you talk about what you saw as the differences in how in the tradecraft of being a UN international public service versus being a U.S. diplomat? I found when I went from the State Department, I went from a headquarters job. I went from being Assistant Secretary of State for International Affairs to a headquarters job in New York, Undersecretary General for Political Affairs. And I found the difference to be far greater than I had anticipated of the two organizations, the tradecraft. You went from a field mission to a field mission. The U.S. charge d'affaires to Libya, to then the U.S. deputy representative to the UN. So talk about the different ways of working.
Well, and I think I reached out to you when when I was selected for the UN position, and you said, well, just let me know how your first staff meeting in the United Nations goes, because what you realize, as we sat around that table, the conference table in Tripoli. First of all, just being in Tripoli was amazing with the United, because I could only, when I was with the U.S. Embassy, I could only go in for day visits, in and out on an Osprey helicopter with the AFRICOM commander, and we made a lot of noise. But just being able to land in Tripoli and drive to the UN compound was amazing, and of course Libya is just a beautiful country. So being on the ground, but then sitting around the table with just extraordinary colleagues. I mean, the UN is the world, and what they bring to the job, their experiences, their life experiences, and many of them have just served in incredibly difficult circumstances. And I think a lot about those in the humanitarian agencies who we really relied on during the height of the conflict in 2019 and 2020, and then also during COVID. So there was that.
And they take higher risks.
You
lost 3 staff members.
So I was going to say, yeah. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that as a senior, and this was my experience, I served in one UN political mission, but I had a lot of autonomy as a senior leader. I didn't have particularly during the Obama administration, we had I called it the 7,000-mile-long screwdriver from Washington to Baghdad, where we had like 3 VTCs a day. So you were tethered, right, to Washington. It wasn't so much the case with the United Nations. The special representative does have a lot of autonomy, which does make kind of decision making on the ground somewhat easier. But on the downside, I mean, yes, I would say, we lost 3 of my colleagues, my UN colleagues were killed in Benghazi. And very few people know about this, that they were basically targeted and assassinated. And there wasn't a lot of, everyone knows about Chris.
Yeah.
And I think that, yes, UN humanitarian workers and UN staff are frequently on the front lines and not appreciated.
But the micromanagement or close tether that you have as a U.S. diplomat overseas versus the autonomy that you have as a UN, the autonomy, but also sort of the lack of headquarters really paying that much attention to you, except if there's a crisis. If there's a crisis with the Security Council, what are the advantages and disadvantages from your perspective for mediation?
Well, I think I prefer the UN model, because we were able then to react on the ground, and we just weren't being questioned and double guessed.
Yeah, I mean, if you had tried to do the Libyan political dialogue forum as a U.S. official, if that were possible, I don't think it probably would be, but the amount of video conferences you'd have with Washington would have been quite high. Stephanie, it's really great to see you. Now let's see what the audience has on its mind. So I'd ask you, we have a firm cutoff at 3 o'clock, so I would ask people to make their questions crisp and to the point. And there are 2 mics, so please. Would you go right there in the back, Virginia? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Hi, Pete Apps from Reuters. I want to sort of reverse the screwdriver, as it were. The world has been through some phenomenal shifts over the last sort of 10, 15 years since the Gaddafi revolution in 2011. And I wonder what you think Libya's story tells us about that changing world, US, China, Russia, Turkey. What are your kind of sort of takeaways from a Libya perspective and a UN perspective as to what the rest of the world's been doing over this time?
Are we okay?
Actually, why don't we take a couple? Other hands? I see, Virginia, I see one right there.
My question was very similar and just expanded a little bit. Could you comment on the historic role of three countries in particular? You've mentioned them, Russia, Italy, and Turkey, and describe what their motives or interests have been in Libya. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we take those two?
Yeah, well, I think on reflection, when I was writing the book, this did crystallize that I think the entire Libyan story since 2011 is reflective of the global dysfunction that we have witnessed. And more precisely, of course, UN resolution, Security Council resolution 1973 was distinctive because of the invocation of responsibility to protect.
That was the 2011 Security Council resolution that led to the NATO intervention.
And that was the last time that R2P was used in a,
Yeah.
in a resolution. And, you know, I think there are many reasons, but it also, what happened on that day through the lens, and this gets to a little bit to the second question, through the lens of Mr. Putin, for instance, I think very much informed Russian behavior, not only in the Middle East, but we can also say in Ukraine starting in 2014, because Gaddafi's overthrow shook him and made him more determined to somehow return to a status quo ante. Then, of course, moving forward to 2014, the external interventions that we saw in the Libyan conflict were also reflected in other conflicts in the region, be it Syria, Yemen. Of course, Iraq had been a theater for external intervention for a while by that time. And the pouring in of all of the weapons and then the mercenaries. So fast forward to 2019, Libya was the largest theater for drone warfare. Now that has been eclipsed.
But it was sort of the initial drone warfare.
It was. It was the experimental theater for drone warfare. And that's been eclipsed by Ukraine. It was also, so this gets also to the second question, where you saw the power then of what we call the middle powers, the influence of the middle powers. The entry of Turkey into the Libyan story really starting in the second half of 2019. And then, you know, how the Turks, but also you have middle powers like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, interfering and having somehow be their policies have to be factored in. And then I think it's fast forward to today. It's the use of military force when perhaps there were diplomatic solutions that could have been more assiduously applied in 2011. It's much easier to pursue, initially to pursue a military solution. It was, you know, well, it took until October of 2011 to dispose of Mr. Qaddafi. But what came after was far more complex. And I think that also makes us reflect upon, you know, the situation now in Iran and what are the options. Because if Libya was complex, Iran it's just on another universe altogether. So, you know, you look at really from 2003, I think the ill-fated decision to invade Iraq all the way through to some of the decisions taken in the Arab Spring and fast forward to today. And I'm not sure that we've learned very much in the last 25 years. As for Russia, Italy, and Turkey, well, you know, so Russia, the Russians, of course, had a very good relationship with Mr. Qaddafi. I would argue that they've actually done better, gotten more accomplished with Mr. Haftar, because with Mr. Qaddafi, they always wanted to have access, really, and control of military bases. They've accomplished that with Mr. Haftar. There are now a number of Russian bases with, a lot of equipment deployed forward. Of course, post-Syria, assets were moved, although initially they denied that they had mercenaries on the ground. Of course, that was just a ruse, and now it's the full-fledged admission of the existence of the Africa Corps. And to a degree, yes, I think that they would like to see a return to some formula of status quo ante, some Qaddafi type model in Libya. If nothing else, then to say 2011 was a mistake, and now we have, we've reversed that. The Italians, of course, do have their own, unique history in Libya with a very brutal occupation, the hanging of, the Libyan hero Omar Mukhtar, and the years of, the fascist rule. But, they are, in terms of their policies now, it's mostly through the lens of migration, which is a very politically sensitive. And that, and I talk about in the book about how if your policy priority is either counterterrorism or counter-migration, that means that you are necessarily dealing with forces or groups in the country who have no interest in state building, right? And this is a dilemma that we ran into in the United Nations. We were left with the, quote, nation building, task while these other countries were allowed to pursue their own sort of binary policy priorities. Turkey, again, has a rich history in Libya, and one could say that the neo-Ottomans are back. I don't think you shouldn't overemphasize it. The many Libyans welcomed the Turkish intervention in 2019. Of course, Turkey was one of the last NATO countries to abandon Mr. Qaddafi in 2011. The Turks were doing a lot of business in huge infrastructure, a lot of commercial projects in Libya under Qaddafi, as by the way, there were American firms that were there too. So that I think that they also look at Libya through the lens of opportunities, economic opportunities. And I would say that since 2019, Turkish policy is far more nuanced now. It's not, you can't, they're just supporting, the government in Tripoli. No, because they have reached out. And you see now that General Haftar's sons are visiting Turkey, that there's more engagement between Turkish forces and Mr. Haftar's forces. So that I think it's really worth watching, and certainly, Turkish influence is a lot, I think, more powerful now than it was when I was in Libya.
There's one question up here in the front, and then we'll take these two questions in the front, and then we're going to have to close, I think.
Thank you. Hey, how are you? It's Al-Hussein from Libya. And I'm a writer and a journalist. I have a comment, rather than a question.
But make it quick, where you have 2 minutes.
Okay, I would say you would not find better person to explain the Libya situation better than Stephanie, even in Arabic or in English. So that's my comment. My question is, how do you see do you think we will see another try from General Haftar to attack Tripoli? What's your assessment?
And here, we'll take the one more in the back too. If this is quick, we'll take the one in the back too.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
My question is two parts regarding the national conference in Switzerland, the one that you held.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, during the conference, there were rumors about horse trading, vote buying, and so on and so forth. So it's used as tainted or has not gone on the right direction from day one. And the second part, was there any kind of a mechanism to hold those people who were chosen to go through the plan as they were supposed to? or was just left to their quote unquote goodwill?
Okay, thanks. And finally, a quick one in the back, and then over to Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks. So Rob Mogilnicki. Stephanie, I think we were in Dubai last time we met in person. Related question, can the Gulf play a positive role in Libya? And if so, what would that look like?
Okay, Stephanie, you have a minute.
Wow, okay. Well, I think, so when Mr. Haftar returned to Libya in 2011, he did bring a lot of baggage with him. And I've always characterized him as your classic modern day caudillo. In other words, he does have very national ambitions. He is not a satrap of the East. He's, in fact, as you know, he's not from the East. He's from Tarhuna. I think he very much sort of sees himself in the mold of Mr. Qaddafi, and that if he were able to assume power, or his sons, that you would see a very strong centralized kind of military apparatus with a civilian government attached to it, perhaps on the model of something like Egypt. Okay, so I wouldn't count him out. On the LPDF, so all the candidates, had to sign pledges, and there was also an ethics pledge for the members of the dialogue. My view was that if there were any proven allegations, that should have been published. It should have, that went to the whole transparency of the process. And that if candidates did not abide by their pledges, for instance, not to run for office, that should have been a showstopper. Post. But, there were a lot of decisions that were taken. I think the international community got very comfortable, and the whole idea of, well, now we have a unified government, it's back to business as usual, and let's focus on our investments in the country and not keeping the momentum and doing what was outlined actually in the roadmap. When the roadmap got abandoned, I think that therefore everything went off the tracks. So I do think that there were some mistakes that were made that could have been easily avoided. But, I think that we can learn from that moving forward. On the Gulf, yes and no. I mean, it's quite fraught, for Libyans, given the experience of the last 14 years and some of the very negative interventions from the Gulf. There is also, I would run into this belief amongst Libyans that, there was almost a conspiracy from the Gulf states to keep Libya in a state of chaos so as to prevent the emergence of an economic rival, given Libya's, oil potential and production, and the fact that it has these gorgeous deep water ports. So I don't necessarily buy that conspiracy theory or that line of thinking, but it is something where, Libyans are naturally suspicious.
I want to thank everybody here in the auditorium with us, and thank those of you online. But I particularly want to thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your thoughts. And I encourage everyone. The book's out there. She's here. You'll beat out all of your friends and neighbors because it's not available till July 2nd. But let's give Stephanie a hand.
Thank you.